A beggar screamed to a millionaire, "Don't eat this. Your wife put it in poison." When he got home, the millionaire was shocked to see what his wife was doing. The morning sun broke weakly through the smog-filled air as a hunched figure shuffled through the streets of the city. The beggar, a woman whose face bore the marks of time and hardship, was an almost invisible part of the bustling urban landscape. Her frail hands sifted through a heap of trash, her sharp eyes searching for scraps that could quiet the gnawing hunger in her stomach. Most days, it was a fruitless task. Today seemed no different. Once, she had a name that people called her with kindness. She had a home, a family, and dreams. But life, with its merciless turns, had cast her adrift. A husband lost to illness, debts mounting like storm clouds, and eventually, the slow erosion of dignity that comes with sleeping on cold pavements. Her life was now reduced to survival, a gnawing need that consumed her every waking moment. As she rummaged, the occasional passerby glanced at her, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disdain. Some muttered under their breath about the lazy or unfortunate, their words cutting through the air like jagged glass. Her lips, cracked and dry, trembled, but she swallowed the urge to respond. Years of rejection had taught her that silence was often the safer choice. In the distance, the sound of laughter and music caught her attention. Across the street, a high-end restaurant glittered like a palace. A sleek black car pulled up to its entrance, and a couple emerged. The man was tall and imposing, his tailored suit radiating wealth. The woman by his side was a vision of sophistication, her every movement deliberate and graceful. They laughed, their ease a sharp contrast to the beggar's aching existence. For a moment, she stood frozen, her eyes fixed on them. The scent of roasted meat and fresh bread wafted out as they entered, a cruel reminder of everything she lacked. But then, something unusual caught her eye. The woman's hand lingered over her purse before she slipped something small and unremarkable into it. The gesture was almost imperceptible, but the beggar's instincts, sharpened by years of observation, didn't miss it. Her stomach growled, but she turned her attention back to the trash. Unbeknownst to her, this moment, this fleeting observation, would soon alter the course of not just her life, but that of the wealthy man as well. Inside the opulent restaurant, the millionaire exuded an aura of confidence and authority. Alan Whitaker was a man who had built an empire from the ground up, amassing wealth that few could dream of. His every movement was deliberate, his polished demeanor concealing the ruthlessness that had fueled his rise. The world was his oyster, and he never hesitated to remind others of it. Alan's wife, Lila, sat across the table, her slender fingers cradling a glass of wine. Her beauty was the kind that drew attention effortlessly, dark, luminous eyes and a serene smile that never quite reached them. She seemed to fit perfectly into Alan's world, her poise and elegance the perfect complement to his commanding presence. Yet beneath her calm exterior was a sharp mind, calculating and shrewd. They were the picture of marital bliss to the outside world. Alan spoke animatedly about a recent acquisition, his voice tinged with triumph. Lila listened, her eyes locked on his, a faint smile playing on her lips. To any onlooker, her attentiveness might have seemed like admiration, but a closer look revealed something colder, strategic calculation. "Another toast," Alan declared, raising his glass of deep red wine. "To success." "To us," Lila responded, her voice silky. Their glasses clinked, and Alan drank deeply, savoring the richness of the wine. Alan, for all his wealth and charisma, was a man who rarely looked past the surface of things. His focus had always been on expanding his empire, making deals, and savoring the luxuries of his success. Lila's occasional aloofness didn't trouble him. He considered it a part of her charm, the mystique that kept their relationship intriguing. What Alan failed to notice, however, were the subtle ways in which Lila's attention shifted when his focus was elsewhere. Her fingers grazed the edge of the tablecloth, her gaze darting briefly to her purse. She seemed calm, composed, but for someone watching closely, her quiet movements carried an undercurrent of tension. As Alan waved for the waiter to bring their main course, The beggar from outside crept closer to the window, her curious eyes peering in. She couldn't have known what lay beneath the facade of this glamorous couple, but something about Lila's demeanor made her pause. Something wasn't right. The beggar lingered outside the restaurant, unnoticed by the bustling staff and well-dressed patrons. Her instincts whispered that there was more to this elegant couple than their polished exterior. She had seen countless people come and go from this glittering establishment, but something about the woman's manner unsettled her. Perhaps it was the fleeting coldness in her smile, or the way her hands moved with a calculated precision. Peering through the window, she watched as the waiter set down a steaming plate of food in front of the millionaire. Alan, ever the picture of indulgence, barely glanced at the dish before resuming his conversation. Lila, however, leaned forward slightly, her posture tense but subtle enough not to draw attention. It was then that the beggar noticed the small vial in Lila's hand. The object was so tiny it was almost invisible against the dim light, but the beggar's sharp eyes caught its gleam. With a graceful motion, Lila tilted her hand, letting a few drops spill onto Alan's dish. Her movements were swift, practiced, and immediately followed by a serene smile as she folded her hands neatly in her lap. The beggar's breath hitched. Her first thought was that she must be mistaken. No one would dare do something so sinister in plain sight. But the woman's composure, the almost mechanical way she executed the act, left no room for doubt. Inside, Lila resumed sipping her wine, her gaze on Alan as he reached for his fork. The beggar's pulse quickened. If she did nothing, the man would eat the food, and whatever was in that vial could take his life. But how could she intervene? She was a nobody, a filthy, nameless beggar whom society ignored or reviled. Who would listen to her? Who would believe her? Torn between fear and a growing sense of urgency, the beggar glanced at the restaurant's entrance. Her heart pounded as she wrestled with the decision. Each second felt like an eternity. Finally, with trembling hands, she pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The cool, perfumed air of the restaurant hit her like a wave. Heads turned as she hesitated, their expressions a mixture of shock and disgust. But she had no time to care. She had to act. The beggar's voice cut through the ambient chatter of the restaurant like a sharp blade. "Stop. Don't eat that," she cried, her voice hoarse, but filled with urgency. The room fell into stunned silence. Forks froze midair, and every pair of eyes turned toward her disheveled figure standing at the entrance. She was a stark contrast to the polished patrons. Her matted hair, tattered clothing, and trembling hands painted a picture of desperation. Alan Whitaker, halfway to taking a bite of the meticulously plated meal, frowned in confusion. Lila's face blanched for a split second, but she quickly masked it with a look of alarm. "What on earth?" Alan muttered, lowering his fork. "Don't eat it," the beggar repeated, taking a shaky step forward. She pointed a trembling finger at the plate in front of him. She put something in it." "I saw her." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The waiter froze mid-stride, his face pale. Lila's hands clenched around the stem of her wine glass, but her expression remained composed. "This is absurd," Lila said, her voice icy but calm. "Who let this woman in here?" She turned to the staff. "Escort her out immediately." The beggar shook her head violently, refusing to be silenced. "I saw her. She poured something into his food. She's trying to poison him." Alan stood, his face a mixture of confusion and irritation. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his deep voice reverberating through the restaurant. "She's lying," Lila interjected, her voice trembling just enough to convey hurt indignation. "How dare you accuse me of such a thing?" The beggar's desperation grew. "Please, just check the food. You'll see I'm telling the truth." "Enough of this nonsense," Lila snapped, her composure cracking. By now, murmurs filled the room. Patrons whispered among themselves, some glancing at the plate, others eyeing the beggar with a mix of pity and suspicion. 2 burly security guards appeared, ready to remove the beggar, but Alan raised his hand, stopping them. His jaw tightened as he looked from the beggar to Lila, doubt beginning to creep into his otherwise resolute demeanor. "Let her speak," he said, his voice cold and firm. Alan's words hung in the air, silencing the room once more. The beggar's heart raced as she met his piercing gaze. For a brief moment, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps he would listen, perhaps her warning wasn't in vain. But then his expression hardened, the lines of his face carving into sharp indignation. "Explain yourself," Alan said curtly, his tone more command than request. I saw her," the beggar stammered, her voice shaking. "She had a vial, something she poured into your food. Please, just check it." Lila let out a sharp laugh, a sound devoid of humor. "Alan, are you really entertaining this madness?" she said, her voice laced with exasperation. "This woman is clearly deranged. Look at her." The millionaire turned to his wife, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'll decide that for myself," he replied, his tone clipped. Lila recoiled, her face a mask of wounded dignity. "I cannot believe you're giving her the time of day," she said, her voice trembling. "She's a vagrant. She probably came in here hoping for money and concocted this story to get your attention." Murmurs grew louder among the patrons. The staff shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. The beggar stepped closer, her hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. "I have no reason to lie," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, just look at the food. If I'm wrong, you can throw me out. But if I'm right," her voice broke, the weight of her words hanging unfinished. Alan's expression darkened, a mixture of anger and humiliation brewing beneath the surface. He was a man who prided himself on control, and this entire scene, a homeless woman accusing his wife of attempted murder in a public restaurant, was an affront to his carefully curated image. "You've done enough," he said coldly, gesturing to the security guards. "Get her out of here." "No," the beggar cried, struggling as the guards grabbed her arms. "You don't understand. Your life is in danger." Lila's composure returned as the guards dragged the beggar toward the door. She placed a soothing hand on Alan's arm. "Let's put this nonsense behind us," she murmured. Alan sat down heavily, his appetite gone. But the beggar's desperate cries echoed in his mind, lingering like a haunting refrain. The ride home was silent, save for the low hum of the engine. Alan Whitaker sat in the back of his luxury car, his hand resting idly on the armrest. Yet his mind was anything but idle. The beggar's words replayed relentlessly, her voice trembling with urgency, her eyes wide with desperation. "Don't eat that, she's trying to poison you." It was absurd, ridiculous. And yet, a shadow of doubt had begun to creep into the corners of his mind. He glanced at Lila, who sat beside him, scrolling through her phone with a serene expression. She seemed unbothered, almost too calm given the scene that had just unfolded. Alan thought back to the moment the beggar had accused her. There had been shock, of course, and anger. But beneath it all, was there a flicker of something else? "Fear? Are you all right?" Lila asked, breaking the silence. Her tone was gentle, her concern carefully measured. "I'm fine," he replied curtly. But he wasn't fine. As they neared the sprawling gates of their estate, Alan's thoughts turned inward. The beggar's warning shouldn't have held any weight. It was the rambling of a stranger. And yet, small details from the past few weeks began surfacing, details he had dismissed at the time. Lila had been more secretive lately, making hushed phone calls when she thought he wasn't around. She had also insisted on handling their household finances personally, an unusual request considering she usually left such matters to him. Then there were the subtle changes in her demeanor, the way she smiled at him but seemed to look through him, the tension in her voice when he asked about her day. The car rolled to a stop, and the chauffeur opened the door for them. As they stepped inside their grand home, Alan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Lila excused herself, claiming she had a headache. She ascended the grand staircase gracefully, her figure disappearing down the hall. Alan watched her go, his unease deepening. He made his way to his study and poured himself a drink. Staring at the swirling amber liquid, he felt a knot of dread settle in his chest. Could the beggar have been telling the truth? Alan sat in his study long after the house had gone quiet, the weight of his thoughts pressing heavily on him. The beggar's warning echoed in his mind, intertwining with the unsettling memories of Lila's recent behavior. He wanted to dismiss it all as paranoia, but a nagging voice inside him refused to be silenced. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of their home, Alan observed Lila closely. She was already seated at the breakfast table, a delicate teacup in her hand. Her expression was serene, but there was an almost imperceptible tension in her movements. She didn't seem surprised that Alan hadn't eaten much the night before, nor did she press him to eat now. "Are you feeling better today?" she asked, her tone sweet but detached. Alan nodded, forcing a smile. "Just a bit tired." Lila's eyes lingered on him briefly before she turned her attention to her plate. "You've been working too hard. You should take some time to rest," she said, her voice light, almost offhand. For a moment, Alan wanted to believe her concern was genuine. But then, he noticed how her gaze flickered toward the kitchen door when she thought he wasn't looking. It was a small, fleeting gesture, but it sent a chill through him. As the day went on, Alan began to notice more oddities. Lila made several trips to the trash bins in the backyard, always careful to go when no one was watching. When she returned, she seemed overly composed, her hands meticulously clean. Later, he found the study door locked, something she had never done before. "Why is the study locked?" he asked casually when they crossed paths in the hallway. "Oh, I was sorting through some old papers," Lila replied smoothly. "I must have forgotten to unlock it. I'll take care of it." Her smile was flawless, but Alan couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. That evening, as they sat in the living room, Lila was unusually attentive, asking about his work and offering to pour him a drink. Her behavior felt forced, almost rehearsed. Alan's unease grew. He decided it was time to find out what she was hiding. When night fell and the house grew silent, Alan made his move. He had waited until Lila retreated to their bedroom, claiming she was exhausted. Feigning a busy evening in his study, he ensured she fell asleep before slipping out quietly. Armed with a flashlight, he headed to the trash bins in the backyard. The cool night air pricked his skin, but the tension in his chest kept him warm. He had never imagined himself rummaging through garbage, but the beggar's warning and Lila's unusual behavior left him no choice. The bins were nearly empty, save for a neatly tied black bag. He hesitated for a moment before pulling it out and untying the knot. The first layer revealed harmless scraps, empty cartons, and discarded papers. But as he sifted deeper, his fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. A small vial. He held it up to the flashlight's beam, his breath hitching. The glass was transparent, and inside was a faint residue of a dark liquid. Alan's mind raced. It could be anything: medicine, cooking ingredients, or poison. Tucking the vial into his pocket, he carried the bag back inside to inspect it further. In his study, he spread the contents across his desk. Among the scraps was a crumpled piece of paper with faint writing. He smoothed it out, his pulse quickening as he read the words. "Administer in small doses. Ensure ingestion is gradual." The rest was illegible, but the intent was clear. Alan felt his stomach churn. Could this truly be evidence of Lila's betrayal? His mind flashed back to the restaurant, the beggar's frantic warning, and Lila's strange composure afterward. He searched the study next. Unlocking the drawers she had claimed to organize, he found several financial documents, transfers to an unrecognizable account, withdrawals he hadn't authorized, and plans for a new life abroad. The pieces began to fall into place. Lila wasn't just hiding something. She was orchestrating his downfall. Alan sat back in his chair, gripping the edge of the desk. The woman he had shared his life with, the woman he trusted, was planning to kill him. A deep anger began to build inside him, but it was tempered by disbelief. He knew what had to come next. The next morning, Alan approached the breakfast table with a newfound clarity and a simmering fury he worked hard to suppress. Lila greeted him with her usual serene smile, her dark eyes scanning him briefly as if to assess his mood. "Good morning, darling," she said, pouring a cup of coffee for him. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than expected," Alan replied smoothly, taking his seat. He noticed how her movements were measured, deliberate, as though she were walking a tightrope of her own making. He let the silence stretch as they ate, his eyes studying her. Lila seemed unbothered, even humming softly under her breath. But Alan knew her better than she thought. The tiniest tension in her jaw, the way she avoided meeting his gaze for too long, it all betrayed her. Finally, he set down his fork and leaned back. "I found something interesting last night," he said, his tone casual. Lila's hand froze midair, her knife poised over her toast. "Oh," she said lightly, her smile not faltering. "In the trash," Alan continued, watching her carefully. "A vial. And some curious instructions." Lila's knife clattered onto her plate. Her mask of composure slipped for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Alan, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice a perfect blend of confusion and amusement. Alan pulled the vial from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. "This." "Care to explain?" For a moment, Lila said nothing. Her eyes darted to the vial, then back to Alan. When she finally spoke, her voice was tinged with incredulity. "You think I had something to do with that?" "Alan, I have no idea where you found that or what it is." Alan's expression hardened. "Stop lying, Lila. I've seen the financial records. The hidden account, the withdrawals, the notes about gradual ingestion. Do you think I'm a fool?" Lila's calm shattered. Her eyes flashed with anger as she leaned forward. "You've always been so arrogant, haven't you?" she hissed. "So convinced the world revolves around you. Do you even realize what it's like to be married to a man who only cares about his empire?" Alan stared at her, stunned by the venom in her voice. "So what?" he demanded. "You decided to kill me for my monies?" Lila's lips curled into a cold smile. "It's not like you'd miss it." The room felt suffocating, the tension between Alan and Lila thick enough to choke on. Alan's mind reeled as he processed her words, her cold smile, and the bitter venom lacing every syllable. The woman he had built a life with, trusted with his secrets, and loved in his own way, was sitting across from him, justifying her betrayal as though it were a minor transgression. "You've always been blind, Alan," Lila said, her voice low and steady, her facade of composure returning. "Blind to everything but your ambition. You never noticed how lonely I was, how little you cared about anything that wasn't your business. And that justifies murder?" Alan's voice was incredulous, the word erupting from him like a thunderclap. Lila leaned back in her chair, her arms crossing over her chest. "Don't be dramatic. It's not like I planned this overnight. Do you know how long I've been suffocating, trapped in this golden cage of yours? Do you know how many times I begged for your attention, only to be met with indifference?" Alan clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. "So, you decided to kill me? To steal everything I worked for?" "Worked for?" Lila's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You mean what you've taken from everyone else? Don't act like you're some saint, Alan. Your empire is built on exploiting the weak, crushing anyone who stands in your way. I just decided it was time you got a taste of your own medicine." Alan stared at her, his disbelief mingling with fury. "And the money?" he asked coldly. "The hidden accounts? The plans to flee? That wasn't about revenge. That was greed." Her eyes narrowed. "Call it whatever you like. But I deserve more than being your trophy wife, a silent ornament to your empire. I was going to take what I'm owed and start over, somewhere far away from you." Alan's voice dropped, icy and calm. "You won't get away with this, Lila. Not after what you've done." "Oh, Alan," she said with a mocking smile. "I already have. Or, at least I would have, if it weren't for that meddling beggar." The air grew still, both of them knowing the confrontation was far from over. Alan stood, his chair scraping sharply against the marble floor. His towering frame cast a shadow over Lila, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she rose slowly, her composure eerily intact. "What's your plan now, Alan?" she asked coolly. "Call the police? Drag our names through the mud? You've always cared more about your reputation than anything else. Do you really want this scandal to be the headline of every paper tomorrow?" He clenched his jaw. She was right. Public humiliation was a weapon she knew he feared. But this time, he was beyond caring. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're held accountable, he said, his voice low and menacing. You tried to kill me. That's not something you can talk your way out of. Lila's lips twitched into a smirk, but there was tension in her movements now. Slowly, she backed toward the kitchen, her hand brushing against the counter as if searching for something. Alan's eyes followed her, narrowing as he saw her fingers curl around a knife. Stay where you are, he warned, his voice like steel. You don't get to control me anymore, she shot back, her tone sharp and defiant. With a sudden burst of energy, she grabbed the knife and bolted toward the hallway. Lila! Alan roared, chasing after her. She was fast, her bare feet slapping against the polished floor as she made for the front door. But Alan, fueled by anger and adrenaline, was faster. He caught her wrist just as she reached for the handle, yanking her back with enough force to send the knife clattering to the floor. Let me go, she screamed, struggling against his grip. Not a chance, Alan growled, his grip tightening. You don't get to run from this. But Lila wasn't done. Twisting sharply, she broke free and darted toward the staircase. Alan hesitated for a moment, his chest heaving as he considered his options. Then he followed, his footsteps pounding against the stairs as she ascended. At the top, Lila reached for her purse, fumbling with the clasp. Alan lunged, knocking it from her hands. The contents spilled out: cash, a passport, and another small vial. Going somewhere? He asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Her defiance wavered, but her gaze burned with hatred. You'll regret this, she spat. Alan didn't answer. He was done talking. Alan's chest heaved as he stood over the scattered remnants of Lila's escape plan. The cash, the passport, and the vial lay between them like damning evidence, the culmination of her treachery. Lila's defiance had begun to crack, her composure giving way to desperation. I won't let you ruin me, she said, her voice trembling but still sharp. She reached down to snatch the passport, but Alan's foot came down hard on it, stopping her cold. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice cold as steel. Lila's lips curled into a snarl. You think you can stop me? I'll find a way out, Alan. I always do. Before either could move further, the sound of approaching sirens shattered the tense silence. Lila's head whipped toward the window, her expression shifting from anger to panic. Alan followed her gaze, watching the red and blue lights flicker against the darkened street outside. You called them, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, a mix of shock and disbelief. Alan folded his arms, his expression unreadable. What did you expect, Lila? That I'd let you walk away after trying to kill me? Her breath came fast and shallow as the realization set in. The authorities were here. She was cornered. But instead of surrendering, Lila's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. With a sudden, sharp movement, she darted toward the back stairs, hoping to slip out before the police could reach the door. Lila, stop! Alan shouted, chasing after her. She made it to the kitchen, her hands scrambling to unlatch the back door, but her movements were frantic, her fingers fumbling. Alan caught up to her, grabbing her arm and pulling her back just as the door swung open. Let me go, she screamed, thrashing against him. Before Alan could respond, the front door burst open and 2 police officers entered, weapons drawn. Hands where we can see them, one officer barked. Lila froze, her eyes wide with fear. Alan released her arm and stepped back, his hands raised to show compliance. Lila's defiance melted into despair as she realized her escape had been thwarted. This isn't over, she whispered, her voice barely audible as the officers cuffed her hands behind her back. For you, maybe, Alan said, his voice calm but resolute. For me, it's just beginning. 2 days later, Alan Whitaker sat in the back of his car, the city blurring past the tinted windows. His hands rested on his lap, fidgeting, a rare display of vulnerability for a man so accustomed to control. The events of the past 48 hours had left him shaken to his core. Lila's arrest, the police investigation, and the public fallout had unraveled the fabric of his carefully constructed life. Yet amid the chaos, one thought lingered above all else: the beggar. She had saved him. A stranger, Someone society discarded without a second glance had risked everything to warn him. Without her intervention, he might not be alive to reflect on the wreckage of his marriage. "Stop here," Alan instructed the driver as they approached the corner where he had first seen her. The car pulled to the curb, and Alan stepped out, scanning the street. It took a moment, but then he saw her, huddled in the shadows of an old brick building, her frail frame dwarfed by the world around her. Her head was bowed, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of something hot, a rare reprieve from the cold. Alan approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, her eyes wide with recognition. "You," she whispered, her voice raw. "Yes," Alan said, kneeling down to meet her gaze. "I wanted to find you. To thank you." The beggar blinked, as if unsure whether she was imagining this moment. I didn't think you'd come," she murmured. Alan smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You saved my life. I owe you everything." Her gaze dropped, a mix of humility and disbelief washing over her. "I just did what anyone should have," she said, her voice trembling. "No," Alan said firmly. "Most people wouldn't have. I didn't listen to you when I should have. I dismissed you. And yet you still try to help me. That means more than I can say." For the first time in years, tears welled in the beggar's eyes. She turned away, overwhelmed, but Alan reached out gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I want to help you," he said softly. "Let me." The beggar hesitated, her shoulders tensing under Alan's touch. Her life had been defined by rejection and mistrust. Offers of help were rare, and when they came, they often had strings attached. She studied Alan's face, searching for ulterior motives, but all she saw was sincerity and a shadow of guilt. "You don't owe me anything," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. Alan shook his head. "That's where you're wrong. I do. You risked your safety and dignity to save my life. I can't undo the years you've struggled, but I can try to make things better now." She looked away, her fingers curling tightly around the cup in her hands. "Why would someone like you care? People like me were invisible. Forgotten." "You weren't invisible to me," Alan replied. "Not when it mattered most." His words hung in the cold air between them. Slowly, the beggar's grip on the cup loosened, and she met his gaze, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What are you offering?" she asked cautiously, her voice trembling with both hope and fear. "A chance," Alan said. "A place to live. Food. A job, if you're willing. You don't have to take it, but it's yours if you want it." The beggar's breath hitched. She had spent so many nights dreaming of such an opportunity, only to wake up to the harsh reality of her existence. Now, the chance was right in front of her, but doubt gnawed at her. "What if?" She hesitated, swallowing hard. "What if I can't do it? What if I fail?" Alan smiled faintly, a rare warmth in his expression. "You didn't fail when it mattered most. I trust you can do this. And if you stumble, I'll be there to help." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed. "I don't even know your name," she whispered. "Alan," he said simply. "Alan Whitaker." She nodded, taking a deep, shaky breath. "All right," she said at last. "I'll try." Alan stood and extended a hand. She stared at it for a moment before taking it, her grip tentative but steady. For the first time in years, hope flickered in her chest, fragile but alive. While Alan worked to rebuild his life and offer a new beginning to the beggar, the wheels of justice turned relentlessly for Lila. The police investigation into her actions uncovered a trail of deceit that shocked even the most seasoned officers. The vial Alan had found contained traces of a potent toxin, and lab tests confirmed that small amounts of it had been introduced into his food over several weeks. Lila's financial records revealed an offshore account filled with money siphoned from Alan's businesses, a small fortune she had planned to use to disappear and start anew. The evidence was damning, and the media frenzy that followed was relentless. Lila Whitaker, the poised and elegant wife of one of the city's most powerful men, was painted as a manipulative villain in every headline. Alan avoided the press, choosing instead to focus on moving forward. But he couldn't entirely escape the fallout. Reporters hounded him for statements, and his reputation, though intact, bore the marks of the scandal. Despite everything, he remained stoic, determined not to let the betrayal define him. When the trial began, Lila faced the courtroom with a mix of defiance and desperation. Her defense argued that she had acted out of emotional distress, painting Alan as a neglectful husband who drove her to extremes. But the prosecution countered with undeniable proof of her premeditated actions. Alan attended every hearing, his presence a quiet reminder of the life she had tried to destroy. Though his expression remained impassive, each revelation of her betrayal cut deeper than he cared to admit. The verdict, when it came, was swift and just. Lila was convicted of attempted murder, embezzlement, and fraud. She was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, her fall from grace complete. For Alan, it was both a resolution and a reminder of the fragility of trust. He left the courthouse that day with a heavy heart, knowing that the woman he once loved had chosen greed and betrayal over the life they had built together. But even amid the bitterness, there was a sense of closure. The chapter with Lila was over. What lay ahead was a chance to start anew, both for him and for the beggar who had saved his life. Alan sat in his study, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. The house was quieter now, almost unnervingly so, without Lila's presence. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of peace. His life had been cracked open, exposing all the faults he had ignored, but those cracks had also let in a light he hadn't expected. The beggar, Miriam, as he had learned her name, was part of that light. After her hesitant agreement to accept his help, Alan had moved swiftly to provide her with a modest apartment and arranged for her to begin working at one of his smaller companies. It was a fresh start, and though she remained cautious, he could see the spark of determination in her eyes. As Alan reflected on his life, he realized how much he had changed in just a few weeks. The man he had been, a figure consumed by wealth and power, blind to the struggles of those around him, felt like a stranger. Miriam's courage and selflessness had forced him to confront his own arrogance and apathy. He began making changes. Alan had always been generous in a superficial way, donating to charities for the tax benefits, attending galas to improve his social standing. But now his approach was different. He invested in initiatives to help the homeless, funded shelters, and created job training programs for those who needed a second chance. One evening, he visited Miriam at her new apartment. The space was small but clean, with a simple table and a vase of fresh flowers on the windowsill. She greeted him with a smile that was still shy but no longer burdened by fear. "You're doing well," Alan said, glancing around the room. "I'm trying," Miriam replied. She hesitated before adding, "I wouldn't have this without you." "Thank you." Alan shook his head. "You gave me more than I could ever repay, Miriam. You reminded me what it means to truly see people." As they sat and shared a quiet cup of tea, Alan realized that his redemption wasn't just about atoning for his mistakes. It was about building a life that honored the courage and kindness of those who had saved him. Alan Whitaker had once believed his legacy would be defined by the empire he built, skyscrapers bearing his name, wealth accumulated across decades, and a reputation as a business titan. But as the days turned to weeks after Lila's conviction, he began to see his life through a different lens. Legacy, he realized, wasn't about power or monuments. It was about impact. Inspired by Miriam's resilience, Alan threw himself into causes he had once dismissed as peripheral. He expanded his philanthropic ventures, dedicating substantial resources to creating sustainable housing for the homeless and funding rehabilitation programs for those on the margins of society. His wealth, which had once felt like a fortress, became a tool for change. But it wasn't just about money. Alan made it a point to visit the communities he was helping, to speak with the people whose lives his actions touched. Miriam became an integral part of these efforts. Though hesitant at first, she found her voice as a speaker and advocate. Her story of loss, survival, and an act of courage that saved a life resonated deeply. With Alan's encouragement, she took a role in his foundation, working directly with outreach teams to identify those in need. "You've got a gift," Alan told her one evening after a community event. Miriam smiled, the warmth in her eyes now steady and unwavering. "I've just learned to see people the way someone should have seen me a long time ago." Their work began to inspire others, drawing attention from media outlets and influencers alike. Alan, once a man of closed boardrooms and exclusive circles, found himself at the forefront of a movement for social change. He used his platform not for self-promotion, but to shine a light on the struggles of those often ignored. For Miriam, the transformation was deeply personal. Her journey from invisible to invaluable gave her a sense of purpose she had thought lost forever. For Alan, her courage reminded him daily of the power of small, selfless acts. Together, they became symbols of redemption and resilience, proving that even from the darkest moments, light could emerge, guiding others toward hope. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Alan found himself standing outside a shelter his foundation had recently opened. The building was modest but welcoming, with wide-open doors and a warm glow spilling out onto the street. A line of people waited patiently for meals and support, their faces marked by stories of hardship, yet softened by glimmers of hope. Alan stepped inside, greeted by the sound of laughter and conversation. Volunteers bustled about, serving hot meals and offering kind words. Among them was Miriam, her once frail figure now standing tall and confident as she handed out plates to a young family. Her smile was genuine, lighting up her face in a way Alan had rarely seen before. He stayed back, watching as Miriam knelt to speak with a little boy clutching a stuffed toy. The child's mother looked on, her eyes brimming with gratitude. Miriam's presence was calm and reassuring, her words soft but full of conviction. Alan's chest swelled with a mix of pride and humility. He had played a part in helping Miriam rebuild her life, but she had done the same for him in ways he couldn't have imagined. She had given him a new lens through which to see the world, one that valued connection over control, compassion over conquest. As he turned to leave, a young volunteer approached him. "Mr. Whitaker," she said shyly, "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done. My brother used to be on the streets, but because of the program, he's working now. You've changed so many lives." Alan nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you," he managed, his voice low. Walking back to his car, he passed another man sitting on the curb, his clothes worn and his eyes downcast. Alan paused, pulling a few bills from his wallet. But instead of simply handing them over, he crouched down to meet the man's gaze. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The man hesitated before murmuring. "David." "Well, David," Alan said, offering a hand. "Let's get you some help." As Alan drove away, he reflected on how close he had come to missing the truth that day at the restaurant. Redemption, he realized, wasn't about erasing mistakes but learning from them and moving forward with purpose. Somewhere, Miriam walked down a new path with quiet determination, and Alan, too, felt ready to face whatever came next.